If you cook it, it turns into solid white, right? It's denatured. You've actually broken down the protein by heating it. So it's not as good for you if it's cooked. It's better for you if it's raw. How about pH? What do you do with your steak? My mother would always buy the cheapest cut of meat she could possibly buy, chuck steak. Then she'd cook the living crap out of it. But first, she'd soak it in like Italian salad dressing. Because the vinegar is acid, and the acid starts to break down the proteins in the meat, so it tenderizes the meat. That's why you marinate a steak. If it's a good steak, you probably wouldn't do that. Okay, and other things that affect enzyme activity, enzyme and substrate concentrations. If I have a little bit of laundry, it might not be enough to make enzyme to run reaction. If I have a huge pile of laundry, then it might be enough to make my enzymes active, like get busy and start turning on the washing machine. So the amount of substrate is many times the signal that tells the cell to open up that DNA and start making enzyme, because we have work to be done. And enzyme inhibitors is another thing. I quickly mentioned that if we can harm a bacterium's enzyme, inhibit a bacterium's enzyme, then it can't run its metabolic reactions. We hurt the bacteria. So enzyme inhibitors are how some antimicrobials and some antibiotics work. They actually inhibit the activity of bacterial enzymes. There are substances that block the enzyme's active site. That would be called a competitive enzyme inhibitor. They don't denature the enzyme, they interfere with the enzyme. Denaturing the enzyme would be breaking it apart, just to say, dissolving it, like breaking all its bonds. But they don't do it that way. They might block the enzyme's active site. Those would be competitive enzyme inhibitors. There's also non-competitive enzyme inhibitors. Those are the two we're not focused on. Okay, this is just a graph to show you pH, temperature, substrate concentration can all affect enzyme activity. This is an example of denaturation. If you have a functional protein in this particular shape and you subject it to acid or temperature, it breaks its bonds. All these little bonds holding it together get broken and it just sort of unravels. And that's what happens when you take a raw egg and cook it. And here's another one of those things you can play. It has to do with substrate concentration. You got a lot of substrate. Your enzyme's going to get busy. You might need more enzyme to use the substrate. This shows you an example of competitive inhibition, and there's more on that in chapter 10, the antibiotic chapter. Here's your real substrate. The real substrate is PABA. Anybody know what PABA is? Para-aminobenzoic acid. What the hell is that? Did you ever read your suntan lotion? PABA used to be in suntan lotion. I don't know what it was doing in there. Maybe it was a preservative. I have no idea. But all I do know is if you got it in your eyes, it would burn. Remember? That was from the PABA in the suntan lotion. So I think they might have taken it out of most suntan lotions nowadays. But PABA is a real substrate for bacteria. Bacteria need PABA. It's a metabolite. They need it to convert it into folic acid. And bacteria need folic acid just like we do. So if I can interfere with bacteria's ability to make folic acid from PABA by interfering with the enzyme that converts PABA to folic acid, then I can hurt the bacteria. And the drug that does that is sulfa drug. Sulfanilamide is a sulfur drug. Sulfur drugs, notice it has part of the molecule looks just like the real substrate, right? So this purple carbon ring with NH2, this carbon ring with NH2, these are the same. So instead of the real substrate binding with the enzyme and turning into folic acid, the competitive inhibitor binds with the enzyme. So the enzyme is going to run the reaction on something phony, and nothing's going to result from it. Competitive enzyme inhibition. Bacterial enzyme has active sites. That's where the substrate's supposed to bind. If I bind the active sites with a phony substrate, then it's not going to get converted into the end product I need. And it's going to prevent the real substrate from getting converted into the end product I need. So I'll tell you a little story, maybe it will help. Or do you get it? You get it?
No, you can tell the story.
Okay. When we were little kids, we were raised Catholic by my mother. And when you were Catholic as a little kid, you had to go to confession on Saturday afternoon, and then you had to fast until communion the next day. So you got no dinner Saturday night. We went straight to bed. And Sunday morning we had to get up and ride our little bicycles a mile and a half to church, and go to church, ride our little bicycles home, and by then we're pretty freaking hungry. But usually my mother had spaghetti and all that crap for Sundays. But this one Sunday my father was picking us up because he had visitation rights, because of course my parents are divorced. And my dad is kind of not the best dad in the world and doesn't care about anybody but himself, so he shows up like an hour and a half late. And by now, my brother and I are like starving to death. So we get in his car and he takes us to his mother's house. You think he's taking us out to dinner at his house? No, he takes us to his mother's house. He takes us to Grandma's house. And Grandma is a very fancy lady. And she has a very fancy apartment. And in those days, it was very fashionable to have those 3-tiered dishes with wax fruit on it, fake fruit. So we get to my grandmother's fancy apartment, and we're on our best behavior sitting on my grandma's fancy sofa, and on the coffee table is this 3-tiered tray of gorgeous looking fruit. And we are so hungry, and grandma's just getting ready to put dinner on the table. The roast is still in the oven. My brother grabs that wax apple. My father was so pissed. My father scolded him and gave him such a hard time, and I'm like, really? That's what a lousy daddy was. Like, hello, let's look at the big picture. What's going on here? You know, it's your freaking fault. No. My brother got in so much trouble because he ruined my grandmother's wax apple. Like, who gives a shit if the wax apple? Years after that, we'd go to visit her, and there was the wax apple with the bite marks turned to the inside. So what happened there? If it were the real apple, the real substrate, he'd have fit the active site, bitten it, digested it, got his end product, he's full and he's making new muscle and fat and bone, right? But instead, he picked a phony apple. And when it fit the active site, it blocked it from a real apple. That wax apple got stuck in his mouth. We had to like pry him open to get the wax apple out. So it blocks the active site so the real substrate can't fit. But what's the result of the phony apple? Nothing. He's not going to get any nutrition or growth out of that. So that's what competitive enzyme inhibition is. The drug, sulfa drug, inhibits the bacterial enzyme by blocking up the active site, so the real substrate, which is PABA, cannot fit in there. And they don't get the end product that they need to survive. Got it now? Okay. It's not really hard. Just need to have simpler explanations. And you're like, really? What is the book trying to tell me? The way they try to explain stuff is like you have to sit down and really think about it. And I know we don't have time for that because it's summer.
We can just skip it.
Here's your real substrate, here's your competitive inhibitor. They both can fit. Competitive inhibitor fits, there's the wax apple, the red one. The real apple can't get in now. Okay, and then B is reversible competitive enzyme inhibition, in which case you could have the competitor removed and then the real substrate could fit. So there's non-reversible and there's reversible. I just focus on competitive and non-competitive. I don't worry about the reversible competitive inhibitor so much. But it's in your book, so I figured I'd bother to show you the whole figure. And then there's non-competitive enzyme inhibition. What's happening in non-competitive enzyme inhibition? Thank you. The non-competitive inhibitor is a drug that binds to a different site, not the active site, but a different site, a different regulatory site on the enzyme called the allosteric site. And the allosteric site, once bound with the non-competitive enzyme inhibitor, changes the shape of the active site. So they also call this allosteric inhibition. I call it non-competitive enzyme inhibition. Okay, here's my analogy for that one. You go up toward Tampa and you see the Sunshine Skyway Bridge. And you want to block traffic on that bridge. You don't want anybody to go to Tampa, just you. You want to have Tampa all to yourself. So you got to find a way to stop traffic from going over that bridge. You want to block up the bridge, block up the active site? I think I'm going to try a different tack. What if I saw a couple of these golden, what do they call those things? The golden bars? What if I just cut some of these golden bars? Then the bridge goes like this. You didn't block the active site, you changed its shape. By destroying a bond or changing a bond, which is what happens when this binds. And this is how heavy metals can work. Heavy metals will damage the enzyme. They'll bind to the enzyme, break bonds in the enzyme, and it changes the shape of the enzyme, so the active site is not the right shape, so the substrate won't fit. So that's non-competitive. Competitive, I'm going to compete for active sites. I have to have a shape that matches the real substrate. Non-competitive, I'm not competing with anybody. I'm just going to disable it by changing the shape of the active